What the heck happened to My Hero Academia? Used to be that you couldn't go anywhere without seeing this series, running into someone, or having someone talk to you about it. Used to be everywhere. It was in everything and every place. Then suddenly it just blipped out.
And then it seemed like everyone was kind of against it. And I was requested to kind of look at what happened here, even from a writer's perspective of where did it go down? Why did it get all this vitriol towards it? I had to do a lot of catching up here. I did it and kind of backtrack and look it over again. So let's take a moment here and let's see what happened. Pace and consistency. God, I can't even speak. So one of the things I noticed right off the bat after doing a quick read through and getting through as caught up as I could is this series has a lot of ebb and flow issues. Like a tide that comes in and goes, My Hero has a strong tendency to set up the stage and build towards something awesome. And it delivers, but then kind of fades out and doesn't hold that stage for very long. It will switch gears and change pace, which can hinder part of the flow. You'll see that in a lot of the arcs where they'll build up momentum. They'll bring in these bullet destroying healing factors or quirk things, and then suddenly they won't be anything, but there'll be a lot of build up to it, and then we'll have a huge moment or characters will be pushed to the side. Now this can be great with keeping the story fresh and keeping you on your toes of what is going to happen next. Because you never know what's going to happen. There's always constant change. But as you, especially when you're reading from the villain's introduction and their attack on the Class A students to the tournament, it felt like there's kind of a loss of its luster along the way. And the threats of the villains are diminished and our focus was turned elsewhere. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still fun, but it felt like we lost the build-up and the tension. And obviously, they were going in a new direction. Things were changing. We had to focus on the other parts of it, but those villains came in and they were scary, and then they just kind of whimpered off like a kind of a tail, like a dog with its tail in between its legs. See, that's the thing I noticed the most. The creator of this series has a very hard time holding tension, but because he changes gears so often, he does eventually return to that set thing he was building up to. And at the beginning of the series, I would say from chapters 1 to 100, if you're reading the manga, it's not as noticeable. It can feel a little glaring in some parts, but sometimes it feels like the story can feel very, like it has ADHD pacing and flow. And at first you don't notice it because we're focusing on a pretty good large cast of characters, but it feels like once we go past chapter 100 in the manga, he starts introducing just a bunch of more characters, and that's what I want to talk about next. Chapter 2, too many characters. Now, I don't want to say this hurt the overall narrative of the story, because when the creator did it well, it was fantastic and pulls you into a larger universe. But upon my second read through, I started to realize how bloated the cast could get and how many characters felt useless or one-offs that never even paid off. He would just bring in a character that might just be a story set piece. And I really think the biggest example that would be Lemillion is he was so cool. He came in, he was the center of attention, and then he just kind of just faded off. All this hoopla, all this big stuff about him was okay, and it just kind of disappeared. And you could even say Deku, who was primed as the main character of this series, really gets shelved a lot of the times, or even in many cases, I'd say that character growth for a lot of these characters just gets sidelined. Like Todoroki, sometimes it's just he's here, he's there, and sometimes we're moving so many pieces, and the overall story being told is really about the overall story of the universe, that we're not just focusing on one character. So that can be hard because if you generally are focused on one particular subset, you're gonna get lost. You're gonna get thrown around. Now, let's say building the student base was fun to watch as the creator introduced us to the main cast of characters and their quirks and stories. But as the story progressed, it seemed like the creator was less interested in telling the long-form story with some of the characters. Like I'm talking about the character growth, establishing certain narratives, and he would just shove in random new characters just to keep going. Now, again, we're talking long-form story. Sometimes you're gonna get tired, or you want to bounce around, or you have other ideas. When you're committed to telling something as long as this, which has been going for maybe 6-7 years now, probably longer, and you're committed to telling a story about that particular character, you may not always be in love with that story. And I think when we look at it from his perspective, maybe this is his way of still trying to tell the story he wanted to, but without losing the energy for it. Now, I'll go back and point towards the school tournament arc as probably the earliest signs of the creator's penchant for bloating up the cast with needless extra characters. You don't notice it because it's so early, but this is when he brings in so many new characters, and you don't really mind because, again, it's them facing off against the Class B. And it fits the narrative perfectly, you know, Class A versus Class B. They're seen as the villain of that sort of group, or the antagonist that they have to overcome besides the other things. So it's not, for me, this is just an early example, but it doesn't actually offset the story, but it becomes very noticeable later on when you just keep seeing new cast member, new cast member, new cast member, and then we just switch gears all completely based upon other things. Chapter 3, 2 types of stories. So, you're going to notice that early on, at some point here, it does switch. The creator of My Hero Academia really focuses on 2 types of stories. One that focuses on the school and the students, and then one focuses on the actual world of heroes and what's going on outside. There's a way that he was able to blend that a little bit with the villains, kind of jumping back and forth, or even with them going and getting their apprenticing under someone. So there can be sometimes a good balance to the act, but then it does kind of get sidelined, or he loses that ability to flow. And again, just talking about the flow and ebb, where it doesn't seamlessly transition. It feels like you're reading almost 2 different stories. And if you're annoyed by the students, you can be stuck with them for a while, but the good news is you're going to move back into the other hero world. And so you're just going to see a lot of back and forth, and it can change, again, the momentum. I think, though, one of the best clear examples of him having great momentum was from the story arc of this class tournament to the Stain arc, because it just flowed right into the next one, and then it flowed right into the villains attacking, them getting their apprenticeship, and you don't notice it as much of the story changing and flowing because it really did have a good flow structure, but you'll also notice later on that he'll build up momentum and then just stop. And sometimes these 2 stories can be at conflict with each other in terms of pacing and bringing the story together. And I think when you're telling a long-form story, that is going to be the hardest part, because you want things to feel consistent. You want there to be a good transition, and you want the reader to feel like they're not just being thrown around like a ping pong across a ping pong table here. Chapter 4, The First Signs. You know, while some of the weak points are pointed out in early arcs, there aren't much to fuss about, as we're just clearly going through it. We're being introduced to the world. We're getting to know these characters. And it does move consistently fast. We don't dwell on things too fast, and the character growth is pretty fun. I think there's remnants there, but it's not obvious. The thing is, there aren't enough to distract from the story or the overall narrative at those points. But I notice once we hit chapter 100 and All Might has retired and taken on the story, we start to take a steep dive in quality. Before this, I truly believed that All Might was kind of holding up the series. Everything centered on him. That was a lot of the narrative. That's why a lot of these characters were doing what they're doing. Just even his phrase, "I am here," really resonated with the story. Before, where a misstep in storytelling would happen sparsely, and the creator was quick to adjust gears and get things back on track, we now see it taking a lot longer and slower to adjust. Once we hit chapter 100 in the manga, we start seeing things kind of slow down, where he's not picking the pace up as fast. It's not moving at the speed it was before, and ultimately this ends up hurting the series, because for the first 100 chapters you might have a few dips in quality, but it's honestly a very strong paced, well story. When you get to the moment of All Might and All for One's fight, it is the huge climax of that particular arc of that story, and you can really see after that the series takes a whole entire new sort of spin, and it really isn't the same after. But it's also around chapter 100 that we find out in real time that the series is actually getting spin-offs, and the creator is now in charge of more than one thing, and at the time I believe the anime was also in production. So looking at it from a creator's perspective and writing, he's no longer able to just focus on one thing. You ever heard that thing, too many things? You can only have your hands on too many things, and then you kind of lessen the quality. And at this point we would have had the Vigilante series, the other spin-offs like Team Ups and the school, and so so he would have had his hand completely in so many other things, and at that point he would have been doing more interviews, and I think that's where you'll suddenly see the focus kind of drop, and things that were probably important before, or just the inability to keep things moving in a certain direction. Because really after chapter 100 we have some glaring issues that the series really takes a deep dive, and again, it doesn't become noticeable until it's really in your face. And that's where it brings me to chapter 5. It was slowly falling apart, you just didn't notice it. Because fans were still riding high from All Might's fight, which cool splash moments such as Red Riot and Lemillion coming into the scene just burst and open. You've got these really cool character moments. Things are just happening, and we're just kind of feeling the aftermath, the aftershock of All Might giving up and then retirement and the world moving into this new thing. And moments like that kept things interesting, and it kept fans and readers engaged. You know, even if you were just reading the manga or the anime, it just has these really fast, quick moments that are just hitting you like, whoa, where's this thing gonna go? And these moments were the talk of the town. I mean, this kept the community engaged, and this is what we're talking about. Until it just didn't. It just stopped. So what was the change? Why did it take a turn, and why did the fans go from cheering on the series and cheering it on and just loving it? What happened? And I want to say it's around this time that we are introduced to Overhaul and the bullets. And it was leading up to a really cool story. A lot of things were happening. We had Eerie come in. And honestly, after this point, you can just see where the creator just started dropping the ball. He started dropping storylines and couldn't transition from one key moment to the next as fast or as seamlessly as he was from the first 100. And honestly, All Might's absence leaves a giant hole on this series. It no longer feels as optimistic. People don't feel as heartfelt anymore. And we are now focusing less on that core story element. We've now entered into the second arc, and it feels messy. It feels misguided. It doesn't have that same streamlined focus that we saw before. For one, the bloated roster of characters comes back into play. Characters that were given the spotlight and many become invested are just thrown aside. They're not even part of it anymore. Or they're just seen there for a moment, they get to shine, and then they're out. Even in whole volumes, sometimes Deku doesn't do anything or he doesn't even show up. And we've been walking around with this guy, and he's supposed to be becoming the next All Might. He's supposed to be becoming the very next big thing. And honestly, it's almost like he's forgotten about. Like, his character growth ends and then just doesn't really pick up until like towards the very, very end. And that's where kind of chapters 1 through 200. Chapters 100 through 200 are just mediocre at best. It has several great moments and great character stuff, but gets sluggish. And the build-up of the universe, the world, the storyline, it's just messy. It doesn't flow. It's just all over the place. Some plot lines get strung out so far and easy to forget, and the payoffs are just too far off that as the reader and probably even the creator, we just forgot about them. That when we finally hit that moment of like, oh yeah, I forgot about that, or Lemillion shows up again, you're like, oh yeah, that guy. And then for a while there were Shikaragi, oh gosh, how do you say his name? The villain, he just becomes a whiny butt, and the villain antagonist for a while there is just lame. There's nothing really intimidating, and it loses its luster, and it almost becomes like every other character is more interesting than them. And to be honest, sometimes that happens when you have such a series explode in popularity, because they give you a chance to connect with so many other characters, but then at some point the protagonist becomes boring, but you have a chance to kind of just get into this other stuff. Chapter 6, The All Might Hole. And I can't stress enough, the lack of All Might feels huge. Just how Endgame for Marvel left a vacuum for many. It's hard to understate not having the symbol of peace and justice involved with the whole story. Brings the story down, brings everything down. The hope and optimism, it just isn't there compared to the early parts. It's more stern and lacks a bit of charm from what it had before, and never seems to recapture that. And some of that is because the main hero wasn't ready to step into that role, leaving a huge empty hole with nothing to occupy. And then we never see Deku really kind of trained to become that part. He just becomes his own sideline character in his own story. But you do get moments where you get the reaction of All Might and his backup story, or the missing part of it, that sort of world left without a hero, the symbol. But that's kind of also my biggest gripe, because up until this point, all the cool moments really focused on All Might, these cool battles, and other heroes. It's all centered around him. So when we're just left with Deku, it's almost like the creator realized, uh-oh, I wrote myself into a hole here. And man, that's great. When you're writing and you finally write yourself into a hole, then you've got to figure out how to dig yourself out of it. When you're a manga creator, that next deadline is coming up next week, and you've got to work around the clock in order to be making that next chapter to get to that point. So I can kind of see almost like maybe from chapter 100 to 200, he was just really trying to dig himself out of a hole, get himself back into a place where, you know, it was thriving. You know, he wrote up this really amazing moment, and then it was like, uh-oh, where do we go from here? And again, we have this huge problem with such a big cast and a big roster of characters that the focus shifts so much. And if you're a fan of a character and they don't show up for quite a while, then you are screwed, because you ain't going to see them for quite a while. And it feels like you are suffering through things sometimes. Like the story just is agitating. Like you're stuck, and you're just, if you stop though, because it's so bad on the one point, you are going to miss the really good chapters that are coming up. I know I'm complaining a lot here, but there really is actually something that comes up really good. This also has been my current issue with Chainsaw Man Part 2. It's just focused so drastically that it almost doesn't feel like the same thing. It doesn't even feel like the same series. what you enjoyed about the series isn't there anymore. It almost becomes a whole new thing. Now, don't get me wrong. I know for a series to go on as long as it like this, it needs to change. There needs to be a refocus. There needs to be something that happens. But often they cut themselves short by changing gears so drastically, it ends up alienating what made it great. And that's where we come to Chapter 7, the spin-offs. Okay, but one thing I noticed from interviews and just timing of things around this time is also when My Hero took off into other ventures with more titles, which I'm assuming meant the creator had to oversee several other things besides the main story. For one, Vigilante started up, and with the class, the shorts, the team-ups, all the other little things. That's when things kind of got packed, and we didn't have as much time to focus, or everything was just getting kind of strewn about. And that's where we kind of go into Chapter 8 here, the coolness factor. One thing for me is in this early part, the roster of characters is more defined, and the cool moments are plentiful. But it's like when we hit Chapter 100, we start getting creator ADHD. And all the cool moments are just disjointed, all over the place, and it just starts to lose its luster, especially when you get past 150 in the manga. When you just start meeting these really lame villains, because Shigaraki hasn't quite obtained and moved forward. Things are just in this sort of zone where nothing's happening, and we're just waiting for things to come back into place. Now, which brings me back to the two types of stories I talked about earlier. It can be hard to blend and flow between both sides of the world, but here's the thing, when it does, it's amazing. It's a rush. It hits you so fast because it's so energized, it's so hopeful, and it just makes you want to cheer for these characters. There's almost nothing like it when it comes to how it blends seamlessly and flows when it hits its stride and merges all the stories and characters together. When you bring all those pieces together, all those characters, you are in for a treat. But you can tell it has to be handled carefully or becomes a mess and can easily fall apart. And that's what I'm saying. It probably takes a lot of time and a thought process to craft the stories that he writes. Like when the series is good, it is so good. Which I think brings up another flaw I want to point out. One of the biggest flaws that isn't so noticeable in the early part, but is glaring after Chapter 100 and further, is the creator's struggle again to keep momentum from one arc to the next. He builds up perfectly, and then he just immediately stops that story and starts up a new story. And I want to say the perfect example of him seamlessly blending, again, is the Tournament to Stain. Those are two seamless stories, but they build off of each other. But when you don't have that build off and you kind of feel you're like, oh, we're starting here again, it can be very jarring. And that's where he seems to take a complete stop and restart with building up, and instead of thriving off of what was built before, he just lets it stop. And so it's like turning off a car and just letting it sit. The quiet moment isn't there. There's just no build up anymore, and you have to completely restart everything. And the truth is, when My Hero Academia is good, it's a blessing from God. It is fantastic. It is overwhelmingly good. But when it's bad, it's kind of horrendous, and it's hard to get through. It's a slog to get through those really bad arcs, because they are... Chapter 9, the honeymoon stage is over. Alright, like many series that start out fresh and capture people's attention for being new and bringing something fresh to the scene, almost seem like they can do no wrong. You just fall in love with that series. Oh my gosh, I love all these characters. Oh, this story is so awesome. But eventually, you start to see the glaring problems. How they chew with their mouth full, or never put away their dishes. Or how about when they never clean up after themselves? Where were we again? Oh yeah. Sometimes the allure of a new series we're so madly in love with starts to lose its luster, and we don't see it through those rose-tinted glasses like before. Now, we have to see it from what it is, and sometimes that means they don't stand up so well. One thing I can say is this series does still have amazing moments, and some of my favorite things I've read in a long time. I know I'm being super critical of it, but I've reached chapter 250. It's like we get our second wind, because holy cow does it take a shift in storytelling from here on out. It's almost like it becomes a whole different series. And that's where chapter 10, My Hero Grows Up. Now, as the series keeps going, I couldn't help but notice how the stories seem to resemble the superhero eras of the Western scene. But I didn't think it was intentional on the creator's part. It just kind of happened naturally. You know, at the beginning there's an undying love for heroes, and we're just whisked away by like the superheroics of everything. Kind of like the Golden Age. We see Superman, Batman, all these really cool characters coming into own. But soon after All Might leaves, we enter the cynical era, where you can't trust anyone. You have to watch your back. And I think that's really the passing of the torch from All Might, the classic superhero archetype, to Endeavor. that's cynical, got a bad backstory. Guy hasn't been perfect, and now he's trying to make amends to it. For a second, I need to praise how well crafted and paced and written chapters 250 to 320 are. I feel, in my personal opinion, these are some of the creator's best work and a great example of his skills. Not only in writing and managing several character plot points, but the art! Oh my gosh! Everything is on display with these chapters. The setup, the build-up, the execution is in top form from front to back. It's like he got a second wind and started sailing the seas with a mission and a focus. The story beats are immaculate, the seamless transition from one thing to the next, the build-up never is lost. You are taken for such a strong ride. It is honestly my favorite part of the series. But if I would have given up and stopped from chapter 100 to 200, I would have missed out on this. Honestly, I spent a whole day reading these chapters on the edge of my seat, ignoring everything else around me. I wasn't even working on my own stuff. I was so enamored by the plot, the characters, and how seamlessly everything went through, especially when Deku gets to meet the other people in All for One and we start getting bigger backstories. All the build-up that was happening before that was just languishing, just sitting there. Finally, we're hitting payoff, payoff, payoff. It's an investment, though, and if you stick with it, you'll be in for a wild ride and not sure where it will land. And here's where I learned the most important thing about this series, about its writing, about its everything. It takes patience. Chapter 11, the second half. This series takes a lot of patience. True, I could say that about anything that has a long-running storyline. I mean, look at the Batman comics, the Superman comics, Spider-Man. Heck, look at One Piece. But if you are truly going to enjoy it for what it is, you'll need patience. Because sometimes things run slow and you're just getting a ton of build-up and character moments. And it feels like you're not moving anywhere and you're just stuck. Because sometimes things just move slow. And it can take a long time to get through those moments. It's a slow burn and can feel like a filler within its own storyline. But when you finally start working on the payoff, he has a habit of not just going for one. He will go after 20 of them. And the results are maddening. As you are reading, you're getting hit with one revelation after another. And they are hard-hitting and tear you apart. Because not only are they world-building, they are character-focused. And he likes hitting you in the face with all of them. But it takes a very good while to get there. But for me, it's worth it. If I had given up and stopped, and had just been like, oh, okay, this is too much, I would have missed out on some of these most dramatic, cool moments. You have the other problem. That even we have to admit. And that's when he forgets storylines and he tries to cram it in. And as a reader, it feels forced. Like he's checking off a box and calling it good. Chapter 12, closing thoughts. And it's beyond noticeable when we hit the US hero, Stars and Stripes. When she enters the picture, which leads into the long-forgotten UA trader, which had been left in the rearview mirror and long forgotten, but suddenly brought back to the forefront. And it comes up really fast. And here's where I feel we see two sides of the creator of this series, and his writing style, but also something that creators of long-form story need to be aware of. You can set up a plot line and let it gestate for too long, to the point that readers and the creator either don't care or are not impacted by it anymore. The reveal of the traitor comes off as forced and hacky, and drops a ball in what could have been well thought out written story. As I was reading it, I grew frustrated seeing the lost potential of what could have been. Now, compared to other storylines where it just gets dropped or it wasn't important, like the Quirk Bullets overhaul, it just felt like a mess, but it still got to the ending. It still did its job. But here is where I got the maddest. Seeing Deku being quirkless and given his powers to stand for heroism. But then you have this other character who is revealed to have been quirkless. And we are rushed so quickly through his story, his backstory, just so that the story can keep moving along, that we missed an opportunity to mirror Deku's side of being quirkless. It's so quickly mentioned, but there could have been a moment where we had the mirror opposition antagonist, like what we see with Spider-Man and Venom. The opposite of Deku. We just never get to fully explore that part, and I honestly think that would have been a really cool story arc. But it's dropped because the creator went, oh, dang, I forgot about this plot. I need to get back into it. And really, I can't fully explain how invested I was from chapters 250 to 320. When Shigaraki finally is getting his groove, when he's finally becoming the true antagonist, and Deku is stepping up to the plate, we see all these things move into place where characters like Endeavor are finally moving forward, and it feels like we're moving back to what made this series so great. And then we're suddenly brought back into another rushed arc. The payoffs felt forced and a mere, oh, I forgot this, better touch upon it and get it out of the way to get to the other stuff. And it's here where I feel we see two sides of the creator. One that carefully feels out the story, thinks of everything ahead, builds up dramatic pacing, and explores all the results. or a creator who has too many things that he's juggling and can't keep them going and starts panicking before he's forced to pull everything back in. It can be jarring and unnerving, and it's totally noticeable. But a bigger disappointment is when you can see the creator is probably burnt out or just not feeling the story anymore. But amid all these flaws, I truly have enjoyed my read-through. With the many ups and downs, if you are a patient reader looking for something fun with characters full of heart, then I really suggest this series. If you have patience and you're willing to get through some arcs that honestly really are sluggish, there are some great moments waiting headed for you. Some really amazing reveals, character moments that, even if it's the anime or the manga, I highly suggest you just wait it out, because when you hit those great moments, you are honestly left with such a great feeling, and you are so taken back. Is this a perfect series? No. It misses and strikes out quite a bit. But to me, it also hits several home runs and grand slams to make it a fun and exciting series. Well, I hope you decide to check out this series, and I hope you decide to come along more.
Oh wow, hey, you made it to the end of the video. I was not expecting that. Well, anyways, thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking through and making it all the way to this. You didn't skip ahead, did you? Anyways, thank you. Stuff like this wouldn't be possible without my Patreon members. Thank you, Brandon, again for suggesting this video. It really pushed me to my limits, and I really enjoyed the whole experience. So thanks again, guys, because people like Brandon and my Patreon members, and those that are even just reading the books and following along, you guys make this all possible. So thank you again for joining and making this possible. Alright, we got more videos coming around the corner. Go ahead and check out some of the other ones that I got around here. You know, like this one.
Choose another video, maybe. You know? Pick another one. Sign up for something. Why are you still here? Go home.